I appreciate that you're all here to listen to me, and I prepared a whole bunch of slides, and I was going to go through all those slides, and then I figured, you know what, maybe I can use the slides as a bit of a guide, but I'll try to explain a little bit more about what I'm doing and how this might benefit you in a bit of a sort of a lighter way that can keep everybody thinking about these things. And the reason that this is important is because fundamentally the best way to raise serious money in this country is to be able to give a tax receipt. You probably all know of organizations that are not-for-profits. Not-for-profit cannot issue a tax receipt. There's probably numerous ones outside the store that are setting up their booths. They cannot issue a tax receipt. And so people are less likely to give money to a not-for-profit than they are to a registered charity, which can give a tax receipt. And those are places like the hospitals in your cities and the Canadian Cancer Society, etc. And the question that is always asked is, well, how do I get to access that money? What can I do to give a tax receipt in order to raise money to promote my idea? Now, until 2018, and you probably all remember in 2012, Stephen Harper gave $8 million in the budget to the CRA to better enforce the political activity rules. And then there's a whole media campaign by left-wing organizations to say that, well, we're really being targeted because where we are in the political spectrum. I can tell you that the Charities Directorate did not do that the Charities Directorate did, in fact, go after people and groups everywhere on the political spectrum. But of course, nobody would believe that the Harper government was targeting right-wing organizations, so there was no benefit in saying anything. But let's see if this works. Okay, so these were the old rules. And now it's just important to understand the old rules because these were limitations which which limited what we did before. And now to disabuse you of these notions now, the basic idea was that charities were limited to using only 10% of their funds for 10% of their resources. So that wasn't just funds. That was 10% of your volunteer time, 10% of your director time, 10% of your desk, whatever it might be, like things that were totally impossible to calculate. And that was one of the problems. Where you did engage in political activities, and there were many ways an organization could engage in political activities, they had to be ancillary and incidental to the overall charitable purpose. What was a political activity? It was, and basically still is, this idea of trying to change a law or policy of a domestic or foreign government. We'll talk more about that later. Partisan political activities were and still are expressly forbidden. And this is maybe where we're going to have a little bit more of a chat. And contravention could result in suspension or revocation, outright revocation of the organization's charitable status. So who's involved in this? Just by way of, so sorry, that's a repetition, I think. So here's just a little bit of background. Registered charities fall under the Federal Income Tax Act. The Federal Income Tax Act is administered by the Canada Revenue Agency. The Canada Revenue Agency has a little division called the Charities Directorate that is responsible for charities. So when I say CRA or say Charities Directorate, it's the same thing, except that the Charities Directorate is just the specialized part of the CRA that deals with charities. And one of the difficulties that actually Preston Manning and I have spoken about many times is that the law in technically dealing with charities is actually a provincial jurisdiction. And because most of the provinces don't actually exert their jurisdiction, it is left to federal parliament to legislate what it can. But because it's limited by its constitutional parameters, most of the law is actually stated by CRA in its guidances and policy statements, which is actually where a lot of this stuff is going to come from, okay? So if you're looking in the Income Tax Act, you're not going to find it. If you're looking in a CRA policy statement, which I've got the link up here, Are we distributing these slides, or are they made available? They can. Yeah. Well, you can do a search for political activities, or you can get a copy of the slides, and it'll be clear. So, and that'll tell you where much of this law is, and you'll see excerpts of it in what I've got here. So now, what is a charity? Now, a charity is not what you think it is. Okay, the lay understanding of charity is not the same as what the technical legal understanding of charities are. It goes back 400 years. We have not changed our definition of charity, mostly because it's just politically tough, let's say. It's too much of a discussion as to which organizations get the benefit and which ones don't. So we've kind of left it up to the courts. But broadly speaking, there are what we call four heads of charity. It's relief of poverty, advancement of religion, advancement of education, and other purposes beneficial to the community. Other purposes beneficial to the community is not what it sounds like either. Other purposes beneficial to the community are basically a whole branch of other cases that government has decided. So you'll see there's no, health isn't mentioned there. Health falls under other purposes beneficial to the community, as does arts, as does many other organizations you're probably familiar with. Now, I think we need to stop here for a second, and I'm actually going to be prepared to answer a couple questions right now, even though I haven't really discussed political activities yet, because you don't need to be an organization that is, let's say, broadly, a church specifically, in order to engage in advancement of religion. And if we're talking about political activities, then we're talking about, and you'll see later, this idea that the issue that you're advocating for is a component of your charitable activity. So for example, under relief of poverty, oops, I pressed the button, shouldn't have done that. For example, under relief of poverty, the idea is that, let's say you're frontline, you're running a soup kitchen, you're giving food to the poor, you're on the street, and you have information. You say to yourself, things could be made a lot better if the law gave everybody 20 bucks, whatever it was. And so you advocate and you say, look, relief of poverty can be done if everybody got $20. And so you start engaging in a political activity in order to change the law. Okay, I'll get the typical example actually came right out of a case that was decided called Canada Without Poverty, where what formerly known as the National Anti-Poverty Organization, they said their belief, no judgments on their belief, but their judgment was that poverty can be cured by redistributing income. They said if we took more money from wealthy people, gave it to poor people, poverty would go away. That was their belief. And so they went to court because they couldn't really advocate their political activity because it was not just ancillary and incidental to their mission, it was their mission. That is what they believed. And they went to court and the judge said, it's true. You are furthering your charitable purpose of relieving poverty by advocating for the government to take money from wealthy people and give it to poor people. And that is a very telling example, I think, because you can be ostensibly, and I just want to make clear, I'm not giving you sort of legal advice specifically, but this is a sort of a general discussion. But you can be an organization that's dedicated to a religious religion generally, or even something less general and more specific. So let's say you're a Catholic organization dedicated, a Catholic daycare. And so you decide that, you really want to engage in furthering your charitable purpose by suggesting that, every child should be mandated to be in daycare. Again, to pick an example. And so engaging in that political activity is directly related to your purpose of running this daycare organization. So this is directly related. So now, relating it back, yep. Well, let me finish this one sentence, actually. Yep.
I'm having difficulty understanding your point.
Yep. Let me relate that. And so the question, you don't need the mic for that. That was, I'm having difficulty understanding your point. So let me say, the point is, and I guess it'll become more clear in a second. My point is that The political activity we're engaging in is directly related to the charitable purpose for which you're associated. So now, when we're not talking about creation of an organization for specifically to pursue a political motive, we are talking about an organization created to pursue a charitable motive, but the pursuit of that is done through political advocacy. Okay, sorry, back there.
So I'm really glad you covered that. Oh, is it going now? Okay. I'm really glad you've covered this because it's something I've been thinking about for quite a while, and there's some long-term political implications that I think are concerning. But obviously the obvious response to this change by the government, and it's not just been in Canada, it's been around the world, that the left have been trying to redefine this for political reasons. But the obvious response would be like, okay, I'm a free market capitalist. I believe in no taxes and really low government spending, all this kind of stuff. And I believe that all those things will relieve poverty because capitalism is great and Marxism and communism is terrible. So therefore, we're going to be a relief of poverty charity that advocates for flat taxes and small government, all that kind of stuff, right? The question is, how realistic is it that in the medium to long term, the CRA or the courts will actually agree with us that that's fair? Because if we look at other examples, it turns out we're not on a level playing field. It's not fair. Certain things get interpreted one way for one side and get interpreted another way for another side. So I'm in the middle of a charitable application and I'm following the old rules, not the redefined rules, because I'm worried that it'll just get interpreted differently.
So I have two answers. The first answer is that we cannot know until a court rules what the court would say. So that's, I guess, with respect to your court question. You know, my practice, much of it is spent arguing with CRA over not only charitable applications, but tax applications. And oftentimes what has to be done is a reframing of the argument to be made clear that this is entirely within the realm of what is contemplated by the law, whether or not CRA policy agrees. So in this case of this particular example, you're actually on very solid ground because you just have to refer back to the Canada Without Poverty case and say how is it any different? Now, if they say no, it's very different because you're right wing and they're left wing, then you're left going to courts to argue it. But a lot of it is reframing, and the Charities Directorate does bend over backwards to avoid the appearance of, at least they used to avoid the appearance of favoritism. But I mean, is it endemic? Sure, bias is endemic everywhere. I can't argue against that. So I think there's one more question, then I'm going to move the slides. No, okay, all right. So why don't we move on to the next slide? So in order to determine whether or not an organization is charitable, it will look at both the stated purpose, also its current activities. And you have to be careful when you're applying for charitable status that you're not saying that really what we're trying to do is advocate for lower taxes. What you may be trying to do is relieve poverty by suggesting that lower taxes doesn't work in that example, but we're trying to relieve poverty by advocating for the free market. That might work, but you can't say we're advocating for free market. So it has to be tied to a charitable activity. The part that I think you, sir, might be running into is this idea of an unstated political purpose. So you want to be careful also if you're going to apply for charitable status. It's not sort of this thin veneer of a charity to which you're engaged in, and really ultimately you're political, because it'll come through in the application, and you want to make sure that the CRA doesn't say, well, really, you're just political. You're not tied to a charity. It really has to be a legitimately charitable activity. And again, this law goes back 400 years based on case law. So it's not something you'll necessarily be able to do on your own. You may need to contact me or a colleague at the bar to say, okay, well, what exactly is the technical understanding of charitable? And this is what I want to do. And does this qualify? Okay, so now what does it mean? What are we engaged in for charitable activities? And what can we do now? So now we no longer say political activity. Now we call it public policy dialogue and development activities. I guess we've used up all the 3-letter acronyms. Now we're at the 4-letter acronyms. And so if you have a foundation, let's say, that is, has money, it can transfer its funds to another charity to engage in political activities. So now, again, if in our example of a relief of poverty organization that wants to open up the free market, they can solicit money from wealthy foundations around the country. Again, you could be suspended or revoked, though, if you fall outside of this. So, for example, if you, and I do discuss it a little bit, but if you start engaging in partisan political activities, you're still subject to a suspension or revocation of your charitable status. Okay. This is what the law says. Okay, an organization that devotes any part of its resources to the direct or indirect support of or opposition to any political party or candidate for public office shall not be considered to be constituted and operated exclusively for charitable purposes. That means if you do any kind of partisan advertising, you're off. You're done. Okay. But the actual definition of the 4-letter acronym is not in the Income Tax Act. It is in that explanatory note, the statement made by the CRA, and which is critical to our discussion. Okay. So generally, it involves seeking to influence the laws, policies, or decision of a government, whether in Canada or a foreign country, by providing information, research, opinions, advocacy, mobilizing others, representation, providing forums, and convening discussions. Bottom line, it really comes down to that same definition as before, that it exists, that public policy dialogue exists where we are trying to change the law or policy of a domestic or foreign government. Yep. Oh, you need the mic?
You can easily get around this, folks. Now, I'll give you one example. I'll give you one example how you can easily get around this. For the last 10 years, I've been involved with numerous veterans organizations in Canada. Veterans organizations that are doing a number of charitable purposes, including, but not limited to, getting homeless veterans off the streets, getting veterans the help that they need from Veterans Affairs Canada. And what we do to get around this is we also raise money to do this, because it takes money to get homeless veterans off the street and get them housing and get them the professional help they need. But we've done a lot of lobbying with the federal government. And we go directly to members of parliament. We go directly to the minister. We've even gone directly to the prime minister and lobbied for changes in the law as it relates to veterans and veteran services. At the same time, we've still raised money for veterans. Some of the organizations, and I think this lawyer is referring to issuing charitable tax receipts, right?
Yeah.
Because some veterans organizations don't want to raise money and give charitable tax receipts. They just want to raise the money, right? Give me $20, we're going to help veterans. So there are ways to get around this.
Well, lobbying
is one of them.
Well, lobbying was never restricted, even under the old rules. As long as it was ancillary and incidental to your political activities, there was no reason why they couldn't have done it. So it's not really a way around. It was always allowed. As what we're getting into here is there's no limitation. You could spend 100% of your time lobbying the government for a change in the law, as long as it's directly related to your charitable activity. You could spend 100% of your time involved in providing information, research, opinions, advocacy, mobilizing others, as long as it's in furtherance of your charitable objective. So let's look a little bit more at some of the specifics. Here's what we're going to talk about now is from this guidance. This is the critical guidance. Again, it's CG 027. There's CG 027. So again, slides will be available. You can just do a search online. So here's some of the things that they talk about. I don't intend to read all of this to you because I have 3 slides with, I think, a total of about 10 examples of the kind of things that you can do. But I am hoping that we'll go through it a little bit quickly, and then we can have a bit of a discussion, just seeing how much time I have left. We can have a bit of a discussion over, what kind of things organizations on the right can engage in order to raise money and tie it to their political activities. So, providing information, public awareness campaigns is a good one. And conducting research was always allowable. But it's research you have to understand that is not tainted. and I've had very interesting discussions with CRA about this, but you cannot necessarily say, well, we're engaging in research that is predetermined to come out to a specific outcome. The difficulty comes up where the CRA will come along and say, well, you're a right-wing type of organization, and what you're doing is you are only researching free market economics. To which my response is, there's different schools of thought in economics. And to say that I have to engage in research each time in order to make a decision as to which school of thought I belong to before I can then investigate the specific question as to whether, or whatever the question might be, is absurd. And so you have to be prepared to educate the CRA about what kind of research that might mean. I think the same thing goes for a lot of these other types of things. You may have to engage in discussions with CRA as to why this is allowable and public policy dialogue. Charities can have opinions. As a matter of fact, I think this is really fundamental to the whole idea of engaging in public policy dialogue. The example I gave before about a soup kitchen having frontline experience and wanting to give its opinion on what the law is, and maybe appearing before a Senate committee or something, that was always allowable. That was always under ancillary and incidental. You can do it now, even more. You can spend all your time appearing before committees. Mobilizing others and advocacy are probably the two ones we think about the most. And you can call on supporters constantly to engage in a change in law that is again fundamental. So just to use one example, if a Muslim organization was worried that, or let's say a law was proposed to ban Muslim slaughter of meat, and they said, look, we can't have this, this is terrible. So they advocate generally for Muslims and non-Muslims to get together to vote down this law and to say, look, we can't have this. That would be allowable. And the reason that that's, I think, a very interesting example is because clearly slaughter of meat is only a very tiny portion of any religion. Yet if they wanted to spend 100% of their time dedicated to this, they could. And so it's that type of example I think you need to keep in mind. So if you had a church that was engaged generally in church activities, and yet something came up and said we want to dedicate 100% of our time to a particular law that is relevant for the particular denomination, it could do that. Yes, sir. But you need a mic. Yeah.
Quick follow-up to what I was saying before, but based on what you've got up here, and it's that last sentence of the first bullet point that I think is the sort of thing that's concerning me, right? Not contrary to hate speech laws or other legitimate restrictions on freedom of expression. Yep. Now, who is writing that? Is that coming from the directorate? Is that coming from the government? Because, hypothetically, a charity could be pro-free speech, and the CRA or the government be like, well, if you're pro-free speech, you're anti-hate restriction laws, and therefore you're not a charity anymore. And that could, if that's being determined by the government or the CRA arbitrarily, what would stop them from saying, well, you can advocate on energy issues so long as it's not contrary to the environment?
This is an excellent question, but if I may, I'm going to just restate it. So I think that the fundamental question is, how do you have a charity where you're advocating against a law that's already on the books? Can the CRA come along and just simply say, well, you cannot advocate against the law that's already on the books because it's on the books, so therefore it is the law? So the answer is, you can advocate against anything you want. That is not, as long as it's in furtherance of your charitable activities. I can't imagine a situation off the top of my head where advocating for free speech is in pursuit of a particular charitable activity, because by its very nature, it's for everybody and it's not. But and I could be wrong. I don't know, but I can't think of that particular example. But if there were another one on the books, so let's say again that that there were restrictions on the slaughter of meat, and there was a particular religion that didn't work for, they could advocate against it, saying our religion is being impacted and we can't practice it because of it. They could do that. And this was written by the CRA, the Charities Directorate, which is the government. So it's yes, sir. Scott.
Just a question on how do they interpret partisan political activities? Because I'm looking at mobilizing others. And let's suppose you're opposed to some aspect or support a particular aspect of a law or policy, that you're in opposition to 3 political parties, and on the side of one, could the CRA come along and say, oh, you're being partisan, as opposed to, no, this was always our position, regardless of where the parties are at?
I have a slide on that later, but the basic idea is you can say this is our position, and here are the ones that have voted for our position. Here are the voting records, but you have to be extremely careful about it. You can't mark with a bigger check mark. It's you got to be very careful about the partisan stuff because those rules haven't changed. I'm familiar with we have good experience with how the CRA implements those rules, and they are very unforgiving about partisan political activity. So you can have the same position. Obviously, that's what you want. You want eventually to have a majority of people having the same position as you, and you can indicate what the voting records are. You certainly couldn't give money. You couldn't give an endorsement. If you invited one candidate, you have to invite all the candidates. Of course, once they're elected, it's a different story. It's the local MP is coming for a visit. That's obviously easier to argue. It's nonpartisan. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question sort of along the same lines on mobilizing others, especially because there's a lot of charities here in this room and there's a federal conservative leadership going on. So I know that typically during an election, you could ask all of the candidates a question and send, say, a candidate survey and publish those results or broadcast those results. How does that apply to leaderships if you're only asking the candidates for leadership of one party?
It doesn't change. Again, it has to be in pursuit of your charitable objectives. And if you're asking these candidates, what's your position on saving the whales? That's entirely legitimate. And if you're presenting them with materials on why they should be pro saving whales, also, it's fine. The fact that it's a leadership contest as opposed to an election is not, is not determinative. No. Oh, I see what you're saying.
If I'm asking like all the conservative leadership candidates, I don't need to then try and ask, random
that
NDPs.
Yeah. No, it's not. The partisan, I suppose, is the word that we're looking to define here. But no, if there's a leadership contest, you ask the 12 candidates, the 5 candidates, you ask them, and then in the context of that, that's nonpartisan. You don't then have to go and say, well, it's also got to worry about every other candidate that could possibly be in another party and in every riding. No, you don't have to do that. Yeah.
Thanks for doing this, Adam. If you're a public policy think tank and your charitable purpose is to conduct research and advance education, can you engage in advocacy? That portion there where you're looking at things like urging certain laws to be changed or kept, doing petitions, those types of things?
Right. So the question, just to make sure everyone understands, is if your charitable objectives are specifically research and you're a think tank, that's what you do, then is advocacy of your findings or let's say advocating for a change in law based on your findings a pursuit of your charitable objective? Well, I would say it probably depends a little bit on the wording, but probably not. You're a pure think tank. You think, you tank, I don't know, you think, you write, and then you publish. And that's it. So if you would probably have to amend your objects to add something else. Okay, and the last 2 things or 3 things I think that is in that, 3 things that is in that policy are things like making representations, providing forums and convening discussions. So again, here's a good example for partisan. You may invite I feel like I'm being partisan, so I'm going to try this side here. Charities may invite competing candidates and political representatives to speak at the same event. You'll notice that they didn't say you can invite one candidate, right? You have to invite the competing candidates. They don't all have to come, but at least you have to extend the invitation. And of course, you can communicate on social media your positions and push for changes. I can think of really no better example than the one that went to court about an organization that thought and believed that the way to relieve poverty was a blanket redrafting of the Income Tax Act in order to take money and redistribute it to the poor, and spent 100% of their time moving in that direction. They would advocate for others. They would speak. They would lobby their ministers and every minister. They would communicate on social media. They provide forums. They would do all these types of things. So I mean, I can't think of a better example than that of the kind of things that an organization could do. But why don't we talk a little bit about that in the context of a right-wing organization? Right. So let's talk about that. So who wants to give us an example of a right-wing, I don't really want to use that, but let's just say an organization with an interesting charitable objective?
Litigating for civil liberties.
All right. Litigating for civil liberties is not in and of itself a charitable objective, right? That's, you can litigate for civil liberties in pursuit of something else. So there are several cases where there have been Jewish holidays where for whatever reason in the locale, the municipality, they tried to shut something down. And so there was litigation on behalf of the community by charities to say, look, this is anti-religious freedom, etc. But let's look for a charitable objective specifically. Just whoever gets it right gets a sandwich or cookie. There only one. Only one cookie? You can have as many cookies as you like. No. I just give me an example. Let's talk about a charity. Does anybody have any ideas? All right, I'll throw one out. All right. How about? Oh, you have one? Good.
Spreading Catholicism
All right.
through mandatory education on Christ in all public schools.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great example. So there you have a Catholic organization that wants to advance religion, if not evangelize, to public school students, and says whatever the restrictions currently are that don't allow for that, says, well, we want to advocate in order to change the laws to allow us into public schools in order to spread Catholicism. Yeah, that's a good example. It's the idea there is you have a religious organization. Its idea is to advance religion. It believes that the best way to advance religion would be to do so in the public schools, and is looking to, they may even need a constitutional amendment, but it takes money, issues receipts, and then spends all of its money on advocating into that direction. Yeah, sure, that's a good example. Anybody else have any examples? You get a cookie, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
What about one with like a lot less of a clear background? Like, I don't know, I don't really know what the Trudeau Foundation or the Clinton Foundation do. What would you say on their end?
Yeah, well, nobody knows what they do, but well, a lot of foundations exist to give money to other registered charities. So it might not be, in the context of existing to give money to other registered charities, I don't know, maybe they'll advocate for a change that requires them to give less of their money to other registered charities. The Clinton Foundation is American, so it's a bit different. I don't think they have a Canadian arm specifically, but maybe along those lines. And that's a very technical example, right? If it exists just to give money to other registered charities, then the advocating for the change is also technical. We want, I don't know, to expand what is a registered charity. We want to expand, we want to lower the amount of money we have to give. That sort of change to the law. Yes, sir.
This one's from Michael Binion. Relief of poverty through fracking in Quebec.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, really, I think I somehow I said I think that may be in jest, but it raises an interesting point of the connection between your charitable motive and your charitable purpose and the not the realisticness, but the relationship between what you're trying to do and the end goal. Allowing fracking in Quebec may have some marginal effect on the guy on the street because it results in greater government wealth and therefore they have more money to perhaps help. So you may run into a problem with the CRA, to your previous question, on saying, look, that's not rationally connected. You can't really expect to relieve poverty in any great way by, well, all right, you might disagree, so you make that argument to them. And you say, look, no, we believe this is 100% related, and they don't have the jurisdiction to sit there and say, you're wrong. It's the same way that, especially if you're religious, I think that they're going to really be very careful treading on that idea of saying, like, we're not allowing kosher slaughter of meat because you don't really need that. They're very, very touchy about any kind of religious thing. Relief of poverty may be a little less so. So I think this, yeah. Scott's in charge of the mic.
No, I was just curious about that because there's a lot of instances with sort of environmental charities being very obstructionist, but you don't have a lot of pro-enterprise charitable organizations kind of like looking for just Canadian growth competitiveness because it's not a charitable purpose.
100%. That is the problem. The protection of the environment is a charitable purpose, and therefore anything done to further that charitable purpose is okay. But we don't have a charitable purpose of promotion of any kind of enterprise, except in economically depressed areas where we may be able to argue that. But under most circumstances, we don't have that. And so, yeah, that's a major problem for organizations that are trying to argue for greater enterprise, let alone free enterprise.
Can you clarify or expand a little bit on the public policy and educational purposes of a potential charity? And I'm in the middle of this application actually with CRA, so I'm curious. Because my understanding is, so public policy is not a charitable purpose, education is. So you've almost got to argue, look, our charitable purpose or education via public policy, but then how at the end of this does the affect the potential to advocacy later on? Because a moment ago you mentioned if you're just public policy, you've got to stay away from advocacy. So how does a public policy think tank then advocate later on, or can it not at all if its charitable purposes are education via public policy? If you grasp my question, if that's not too convoluted.
Yeah, no, I think I understand. Yeah, public policy in and of itself is not charitable. Public policy is a means to an end. So if you exist to do something charitable, again, back to relief of poverty, and you undertake public policy research to have a position, and then you advocate for that position because you believe it will relieve poverty, you're okay. But a think tank that engages in public policy research, all it can do is research and publish those results, and then wait for some other organization to pick up the torch. So I think that's really where we're looking at. If you want to engage in advocating your public policy research, change your objects. Get a charitable object and go with there. And again, be very, very careful about changing your charitable objects. The law on that is very old and complicated. There are certain things that are obviously acceptable because we see them out there, but even then, a lot of charitable organizations were registered years ago, and the CRA's position on this may have shifted a bit. I think there's one more question or two, but let me just finish up the slides and we can chat as long as you like. Or at least until the next group kicks me off. So, right, so there's no limit. The important part, of course, sorry, I'm not doing that. So the expenses count towards the disbursement quota. Bottom line is that advocating for a change is actually a charitable activity in and of itself, which is of clear importance. So now to the question about partisan political activities, you couldn't you couldn't engage in them directly or indirectly. So you couldn't make a donation to a political party. You can't endorse, can't do a negative endorsement. You know, like it's not just, you know, vote for Al. It's don't vote for Bob, Carol, or Dave is the same thing. You can't engage in indirect support. You know, so you'll see the examples there. Both of these are, especially the indirect support, is a little bit difficult because if you have a position, you know, let's say again you're, well, let's say you're a pro-life organization, and you make it clear what your position is, and then the candidates are pro-choice candidates, then one could argue you're indirectly opposing the candidate simply by virtue of the fact that you hold a diametrically opposed position on that particular issue. So you just have to be careful not to be seen to be adopting that position simply to be counter to that candidate. You know, you have a long-standing position. It is an election. You are free to tell everyone what your position is, and the fact that it is opposite what another candidate is, you know, is a fact of life. It's not a fact of you engaging in indirect opposition. So, and we've never seen that litigated. We don't know. I would caution care, but I don't think you should necessarily muzzle yourself. An election is when you want to speak, not when you don't want to speak. Okay, here's some examples of allowed activities as we had before we went through some of that. Yeah, communicating about the policy issues, either in an election period or outside, and informing the public about your policy positions. But be careful. Again, you monitor your website. We had one situation, one client, where they made just an error on their website. And that was a very large, high-profile right-wing organization. But there was just one small mistake, and somebody scoured the website to find this one mistake of just, you know, I think they did a shift in their back end of their website, and some page that should have come down stayed up, and the CRA found that and went after them for partisan political activities. And it was, I mean, it was almost like a joke, like, you know, just one little page on an entire website, and that's what happened. So you have to be very careful, and you also should be careful that your charity employees and representatives are clear when they speak on political activities, especially if it's partisan political activities, which hat they're wearing. Are they speaking in their personal capacity, or are they speaking in a capacity of representing the organization? This is hard for like synagogues or churches, or, you know, most organizations like that have a you know, a rabbi is a rabbi in and out of the synagogue, you know. So if the rabbi is speaking about their activities and calls themselves rabbi because that is their title, you don't want the CRA coming along and saying, well, you know, you're actually representing the organization because you use your title. So again, this is an example where sometimes the CRA needs a bit of education. We said, you know, look, the individual has that title regardless of which capacity they're in, but they are entitled to have a private life and to have that private position. So you are, again, have to be careful, but so you would say, let's say rabbi, but you wouldn't put the name of the synagogue underneath, something like that, in order to be clear. And I think I've got one more slide. Yeah, this is the last slide. So the T3010 is basically the tax return for charities that get filed at the end of the year. And you have to report what kind of public policy and dialogue and development activities you're engaged in on the return. Now, and so what that means is you have to track it during the year. And because what happens is if the CRA audits you, they're going to come along and they're going to say, oh, this particular activity you engaged in, you said it was a charitable activity, but really it's a PPDDA activity, and you didn't record it as a PPDDA activity, you recorded it as your charitable activity. Now, not only do we get you for, you know, I mean, we can't punish you for engaging in the PPDDA activity, but we can punish you for not reporting it, because not reporting correctly on your tax return is a sin, just like it is with on your personal tax returns. So when you engage in these activities, you have to make sure to track it so that you can report properly. So what you may want to do is speak to your accountant now or your bookkeeper or whoever, find out what the, take a look at the form, try to understand what you need to track, especially as we were entering into both a leadership contest and provincial election in Ontario period. You'll want to know what you need to keep track of, what accounts to set up, what receipts to put where. So that would be important. So, and right on time. So, but I'm happy to take any additional questions. No, I'm happy to take whatever questions.
Yeah, we have one more question here.
On the previous page at the bottom where you talk about not using resources, charity resources, how broad is that? For example, I work for a charity. I raise money to buy a laptop computer that I use, and if I leave the charity, then I either have to surrender the laptop or provide my own money to buy it. But it's technically theirs for the time I'm there. If I type something on that and print it on my own personal printer for distribution in support, say, of one candidate, am I wrong?
Technically, yes. Technically, the charity is in trouble because you engaged in partisan political activities on their resource, perhaps while they were paying you to engage in that. If you're, I'm just saying, but in your particular case, perhaps not. But on a practical level, I've never seen a CRA audit go and actually look at the usage logs of the devices to say, you know, this is what this is. They're much more interested in paper and where things are. So that's why I'm suggesting that the T3010 issue is not a small one. Really got to be careful because that's the easiest part for an accountant to hold on to. So if you're going to fall offside, it's either going to be engaging in partisan political activities, which because by their nature they're public, or by a T3010 because that's just the kind of thing that accountants like to do, is go through papers like that. Before Troy speaks, sorry, I am going to be around for the afternoon. My information is on the bottom of the slides or up there, and you can just give me a call anytime. Happy to chat.
And all these sessions are recorded as well. Eventually, we'll get them posted for those of you that would like them as reference. And we can get your slide deck as well?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'll send it along.
All right, send that along to me and we'll make it available to you. So thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it as always.
Yeah, my pleasure.